The European Union is the world's largest trading bloc, with a population of 500 million people, which represents an enormous market. The European Union accounts for some 20% of the world's GDP. Here in the UK, between 40 and 50% of our exports go to the European Union. About 3.5 million jobs are connected with those companies that export to the EU. If we wish to derive maximum advantage from this privileged position that we have on the periphery of the European continent, then we should continue to help fix the rules under which British companies can operate and compete, have a seat at the table when the decisions are taken, and continue to promote and encourage jobs, trade and investment for working people in this country. If you look at a country like Norway, which had a referendum on whether or not it should join the European Union, and there was a small majority against Norway joining. If you look at Switzerland, that geographically is right in the middle of the European Union. In each case, these countries have access to the single market, but they may have to pay tariffs on a whole series of goods. They certainly will have to pay a budget contribution, and they will have no say in the decisions that are taken on the running of the single market. And to give that up would seem like a bit of a leap in the dark, and it's hard to see what we would gain out of doing that. My argument to the people who say that is to go and listen to what the Secretary General of the Commonwealth said on British radio yesterday, and that is that the Commonwealth countries themselves are very happy with the situation where Britain is a member of the European Union. The two are not mutually exclusive, so it's really hardly an option to go to the other side of the world and give up all the advantages that we have on our doorstep. First of all, the European Union is based on the concept of a social market economy. The European Union has always recognized the importance of what they call in the treaty social partners, which includes trade unions. Trade unions have a formally recognized role in the running of the European Union. The European Union was founded on an agreement between social democracy and Christian democracy at the end of the Second World War. The social record of the European Union is impressive, in my opinion, and has become more so over the last few years, when we've seen the adoption of a whole series of new social measures that would probably have never been applied in this country if it hadn't been for the European Union. And by that, I'm thinking of 20 days paid leave every year for all workers, paternity leave, maternity leave, the possibility for people not to work excessive hours, proper arrangements for temporary workers and posted workers and agency workers, a whole series of measures that have brought forward the idea of a social Europe. There's a lot more to be done, but the foundations have been laid by recent legislative decisions taken by the European Union. The European Union has cleaned up our beaches, improved our water supply, and drastically reduced air pollution, at least has laid down standards which, if they were properly applied by the British government, would drastically reduce air pollution. Environment is one of those issues which respects no borders, that we can only face up to the dangers of climate change and global warming if we join forces with other countries, not just in Europe, but actually around the world. And the European Union has led that fight to combat the negative effects of climate change and to reduce carbon emissions. In Britain, we could do more to make the government more accountable to Parliament. We could do more to make the EU Scrutiny Committee in the House of Commons have real powers, but possibly the government doesn't want that. The European Union should do more, for example, by taking legislative decisions in the Council of Ministers in broad daylight, not in secrecy, but in full transparency. Perhaps one could consider changing the electoral system for the European Parliament so that MEPs become a bit better known and appear less remote to their citizens. Well, I would say that the champions of the free market in Europe and of light touch regulation, particularly in the banking sector, are to be found not in Brussels but in London. And I find it slightly strange that we should be accusing the European Union of being the principal advocates in Europe today of the free market, when the European Union is very often in disagreement with the current British government because of the British government's free market and ideologically driven philosophy. In the Treaty of Rome, the European Union was set up as a social market economy. The countries of the European Union have the highest level of social protection of any countries in the whole world. The European Union is constantly striving for that balance to try and make the market properly regulated and fair and balanced while enabling companies to compete on world markets. And it's that balance that is hard to achieve, but on the whole, I think the European Union gets it right. I think it's good for British Steel to be in Europe because we export half of our steel to Europe, first of all. Secondly, by being in Europe, we have much more clout when we have to deal with our competitors, in particular the Chinese. Some may say that the EU rules on state aid, which to some extent relate directly or indirectly to the steel industry, favour the right-wing ideology of the Conservative government. But as I've said before, the Conservative government is in a minority on this issue, actually on quite a number of other issues in Europe. If I could be a little bit sort of sentimental, even in this very worrying situation, the European Union was founded on coal and steel. The precursor of the European community was the coal and steel community. It was steel workers and mine workers who were the first workers in the new Europe who worked together across the frontier between Western Germany and Eastern France in the 1950s. And that tradition continued up until the 1980s. I was working in Luxembourg at the time, and I met several times Bill Sears, who was the leader of the Steelworkers Union at the time. And in those days, workers for the Steelworkers Union and the National Union of Mine Workers would come to Luxembourg for help and support and ideas and money to carry on the struggle against Mrs. Thatcher and her closure of the steel industry and the mining industry. So there's quite a lot of history here. But to come back to present time, the European Union has these state aid rules. It would not allow, if he wished to do so, and he wouldn't, David Cameron to hand a large envelope with lots of money to Tata Steel. But what the rules do allow, in accordance with a whole series of criteria, is loans, loan guarantees, restructuring, retraining, the European Globalization Adjustment Fund for people whose work situations are adversely affected by globalization effects on their industry. So working together with the other countries who have a different experience from ours in the steel industry can only benefit. We must reduce energy costs for the steel industry. We must reduce business rates. But above all, our government, be it Conservative or Labour, must have a strategy for the survival of the workers in Port Talbot and all the other families who depend on the steel industry. Other countries have done it. Other countries have received state aid. Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, to name but four, over the last 2 years. If they can do it, Britain can do it, and we should be up there fighting for the workers of Port Talbot. What Europe and the European Union is trying to do is to encapsulate the systems and common standards and legislation of 28 countries into one single set of rules. And I think even if occasionally it may appear a bit cumbersome, it's better to have one set of rules than 28. And that's the first point. The other point is that all too often when people talk about too many rules and pettifogging bureaucracy in Brussels. What they actually mean is that they don't agree with health and safety legislation or workers' rights. So I think one should be careful about giving too much credence and seriousness to that kind of criticism. Well, actually, I think it means that we have more control over our own borders. And if Britain were to leave the European Union, if we want to remain in the single market, we'd still have to allow freedom of movement, which is an absolutely indispensable precondition of being in the single market. What would happen, and which would be less easier for us to deal with, would be that the frontier with the European Union, and specifically with France, would move from Calais to Dover, and then we'd have another difficult border situation to deal with, which would be between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So actually, I feel that the situation in terms of having control over our borders would be much more difficult if Britain were to leave than it is now. Well, we've heard a lot of statistics flying around from both sides of the argument during this first part of the referendum campaign. All statistics, whether they come from leavers or remainers, are invariably based on some kind of assumption, and so to be treated with a pinch of salt. But let me give you one almost incontrovertible fact, and that is that the amount of money that Britain pays into the EU every year is just under half of 1% of Britain's GDP. And if you compare that with the amount of money that this government spends every year on paying the interest on our deficit that they have been unable to bring down, well, actually, we spend 5 times more every year in paying back the public deficit than we do in financing all the advantages that we derive from our membership of the European Union. This is not just any old vote. It's not like in a general election when you vote one year and you go back again 5 years and you realize that you made a terrible mistake 5 years before and you get rid of one lot and put in the others. This time it's kind of forever. You won't be able to change it. This is the most important vote that you will ever make in your lifetime in determining the kind of future that your country will have and the kind of country that you and your children, your grandchildren will live in. This is the most dangerous period that Europe has known since the end of the Second World War. We have a sluggish economy. We have, all our countries are suffering from budget deficit, and in the case of the UK, an ever-growing trade deficit. And if we go on like this, we will not be able to support those unparalleled levels of social protection that Europe has known since the end of the Second World War. We have 4 million migrants now banging on the door, trying to be allowed into the European community of nations, with all the difficulties of integration that will imply. But we have to do our duty by those people and find the fairest and most effective way of processing their asylum applications, distinguishing between genuine refugees and economic migrants. There will be tough decisions to be taken, but Europe has to do its duty and to find a humane way of looking after this unprecedented flow of migrants from the southern banks of the Mediterranean. And then on Europe's eastern flank, we've got difficulties in our relations with Russia. We've seen the annexation of Crimea. We've seen the problems in Ukraine. But the most frightening and worrying factor of all is the rise of extremist and nationalist and xenophobic parties all over Europe. There are many, many points of comparison with what's happening in Europe at the moment with what happened in the 1930s. And what did Britain do then? Instead of joining forces with democracies the other side of the Channel and the North Sea, we voted for appeasement for 10 years, and the rest is history. We mustn't make that mistake again. I think that most young people know better than I do why they should vote. So I'm not going to tell them why they should vote, but I'm going to say that I'm quite proud of what Europe has done for young people, and I hope that they themselves will develop, carry forward, and make even better some of the decisions that have been taken, the policies that have been applied to help young people. I know there's a lot of concern among young people who fear for their futures, who don't see much in the way of job security, who are not attracted overly by the political system. But the decision that you'll be taking to go and vote on the 23rd of June in this referendum is beyond political parties. It really is your chance to shape your country. You'll never have another chance to do it in the same way that you will in this particular referendum. The European Union needs the next generation. It needs the next generation to shake up the institutions of the European Union. It needs an injection of generosity of spirit and new democracy and new ideas. It needs the millennials, it needs young people to go out there, tell us where we're going wrong, and allow Europe to make that fresh start that we desperately need at the moment. So I would appeal to all of you young people to register first, if you're not already registered, to go out and vote, and preferably to vote for Britain to remain. It's your Europe, it's your Britain, it's your responsibility.